universe of information would deliver us into a golden age.
Take a look.
At least that was the promise.
Excellent
The
connection.
problem with it was it did not last long.
It's
So
here
what
it goes,
happened?
there it goes.
What happened is what this episode of Ideas is about. I'm Nala Aya, and the speaker is Sue Gardner. Sue began her career in CBC television and radio, and then took a fledgling CBC.ca to international prominence. In 2007, she went to San Francisco and Silicon Valley, where she helped make Wikipedia what it is today. In 2012, Forbes magazine named Sue Gardner among the top 100 female executives in the world, all of which lends even more gravity to her observations about the media landscape today.
The news industry is continuing to collapse. We are just now at the very beginning of starting to experience the real-life repercussions of living in a world that has significantly weakened journalistic institutions.
Those repercussions are at the heart of a talk Sue Gardner gave at the Glenn Gould Studio in Toronto in May 2018. And what she said then is even more relevant now.
This is all terrible. But here's what's arguably worst. Faith in democracy appears to be the lowest among young people. So since 1995, what the data says is each new generation of young people has become successively less supportive of democracy than the generation that preceded it.
Journalism in decline, faith in democracy eroding. That the two are linked came out of a paper Sue had been commissioned by the Knight Foundation to research and write on the future of public broadcasting.
So here is my argument. The public broadcasters, they were designed to elevate the societies in which they operated. They were designed to help those societies be smarter and better informed, more healthily pluralistic, more socially cohesive, and frankly, more successful, right? Healthy, successful societies. For decades, they did exactly that. And in Canada, I will note, the CBC did it in pretty difficult circumstances.
Well, we're in pretty difficult circumstances now, all of us. Hyper-partisan politics, fake news in a post-truth era, where the media, including public broadcasters like the CBC, are increasingly seen as irrelevant or worse. But Sue Gardner argues that they're critical for the future of civil society. One last thought. If it seems self-serving for a public broadcaster to talk about the importance of public broadcasting, I'd offer this for you to think about. You paid for it. It belongs to you.
So I wanted to start tonight by explaining how this piece came into existence. I got a call from the Knight Foundation, which is a private grant-making institution in Miami, Florida that funds journalism. It was coming up on the 50th anniversary of public broadcasting in the United States, and Knight wanted me to do an assessment of the state of public broadcasting on that anniversary. And so they wanted to know, did I think that it was still valuable? Was it something that we still needed? Was it a useful thing? Was it any good anymore? And at first I kind of thought, I thought it sounded, it was an important topic. It was also a fairly earnest topic. It felt a little bit like investing in getting excited about broccoli. I knew that I should like it and I should want to do it, but it did feel a little bit kind of meh. But then I thought about it some more, and in the end, I said, yeah, that sure, I would do it. And the reason I said yes was because I came to realize I actually didn't know what I thought about public broadcasting at that point. And so I was curious to actually do a little bit of digging in and try to find out. And so I said yes to the Knight Foundation. And then what I did was I spent a truly ridiculous amount of time traveling around. I interviewed a whole bunch of people. I read everything that I could get my hands on, and so I read a bunch of books and historical documents and government legislation. I read a ton of academic research into the effects of public broadcasting. I read their annual reports. Google Translate was super helpful there, and I read their financial statements. So basically, I kind of soaked up everything that I could find so I could get like a real broad and sort of proper kind of view. And I have to say that what I encountered in my research Some of it did not surprise me. Some of it did surprise me. Some of it opened my mind. It opened my eyes to things that I thought that I knew, but I wasn't really sure that I had known. And I'm hoping, and I think that here and there, you will be a little bit surprised too. So I'm going to sketch out what public broadcasting was designed to do and what it did do in its early days. Then I'm going to talk through the sort of initial stages of its decline, which started in the 1980s. And then I'm going to try to project a little bit into the future. So what it would be like if we carry on as we are now versus what it could be like if we decide that we want to try for something a little bit different and a little bit better.
Send the direct link if you want.
Let's cast our minds back to the past. And so if we can think now about the 1950s or the 1930s or even the years in which I was growing up, the 1970s. For a lot of the 20th century, the public broadcasters did exactly what they were designed to do. So they provided a broad range of programming to the public that was both high quality and it was also popular. Their job was to inform, enlighten, and entertain the people of their countries, and that's pretty much what they did. They covered wars, they covered politics at every level, they covered important social issues and conflicts of the day. They produced highly successful natural history programming, science programming, educational material, and children's programs. They broadcast pretty much every genre of music, everything from opera to jazz to folk to hip hop. And they aired things like the FIFA World Cup and the Olympics. And they created entertainment programming that was deeply loved by the people in their countries. So the Danish costume drama Matador, there was a German crime series called Tatort, there was an Italian dramatic miniseries called La Pietra, and the United Kingdom, a lot of their programming became popular and well-known throughout the English-speaking world, and so things like Monty Python's Flying Circus, Doctor Who, Fawlty Towers, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Coronation Street. So each broadcaster told the stories of the country in which it operated. For more than 50 years, public broadcasters commanded the attention of large audiences, and they had significant power and significant influence. There's a British media historian named Jean Seaton, and she describes broadcasting back then as a mighty behemoth. It was forging powerful collective experiences, and it constituted the common coin of everyday life. But toward the end of the 20th century, the public broadcasters' influence started to fade. In the 1980s and the 1990s, cable TV started to come into widespread use in Europe and in North America. And because cable could carry more distinct channels than transmitter towers could, regulators were able to give out more broadcast licenses. And that led to a big increase in the number of TV channels that were available to the people in any given country. At the same time as the technology was changing, the political winds were shifting as well. So the governments of Western democracies, they had spent a lot of the mid-20th century in institution building mode. They've been creating not just the public broadcasters, but also a lot of other large publicly funded institutions. In the 1980s, though, beginning with the Thatcher government and the Reagan government, and then later also the Mulroney government here in Canada, governments started to take a more market-centered approach. So they had come to believe that the key to prosperity for their countries lay in making the government smaller and in creating a kind of optimally favorable environment for the private sector. And that led to a wave of deregulation and privatization and cost-cutting. During this time, practically every public broadcaster around the world started to have its funding cut. In Canada, that happened first with the Mulroney government in 1985. It implemented a total of about $120 million in cuts to the CBC. And then later, when Jean Chrétien was running as the Liberal leader, he campaigned on promises to restore the CBC's funding, but when he was elected Prime Minister, he didn't do that. Instead, he made further cuts, and they were just as deep as those that had been made by his predecessor. So between 1985 and 1995, the CBC's budget was cut by almost half. So by the beginning of the 21st century, we had seen this big increase in competition, a lot of new channels, and we had seen large cuts to public broadcaster budgets. And those two phenomena completely transformed the broadcasting landscape. Previously, in Western democracies, broadcasting had been dominated by the public broadcasters. They were funded with public money, and they each had a monopoly or pretty close to a monopoly in their country. But by the year 2000, broadcasting was a global marketplace. It was made up of thousands of channels. A lot of them were owned by American companies, and they offered American programming. And in the non-English speaking part of the world, they offered adaptations or dubbed versions of programming that had originated in the United States. So at this point, the public broadcasters that had been at the center of everything were starting to get pushed to the margins. They were being pushed to the periphery. But what was actually probably most consequential was what happened next. It was how they responded to that. The public broadcasters responded to the cuts by seeking to increase their commercial revenues because they want to make up the gap, right? The money that they had lost. In retrospect, this was probably a mistake. So within 10 or 20 years, many of the public broadcasters, including here at the CBC, they were making as much as a third of their total revenue from advertising and from other commercial sources. And inevitably, this started to affect their programming. So they became more and more like the private broadcasters in terms of their pressures, in terms of the incentives for them, in terms of how they measured success internally and externally. And so in 1999, a McKinsey study found that public broadcasters' new dependence on commercial revenues, and this is their word, it had inexorably led to programming that was hard to distinguish from that of commercial broadcasters. So these public broadcasters, they had been producing major benefits for the countries that they've been serving. And so as we start to talk about their decline, I want to take a minute to note what it was that we were starting to lose. So this is where the academic research comes in. Public broadcasters, compared with their commercial counterparts, they produce more hard news and more current affairs programming. That means more international news, more domestic politics, and more coverage of public policy issues. The materials and the programming that public broadcasters create, they are less sensationalist, they are more balanced, and they're more focused on policy substance instead of being focused on horse race coverage or palace intrigue coverage. People exposed to news on public TV are better informed than people exposed to news on private TV. People exposed to news on public TV are likelier to vote. People exposed to news on public TV have more realistic perceptions of their societies, especially on issues related to crime and to immigration. They are less likely to express negative attitudes towards immigration and immigrants. Countries that have strong and well-funded public broadcasters, they have higher levels of social trust and social cohesion. And the people who live in those countries are less likely to hold and to express extremist political views. So maybe this is the part where I stop down for a second and I note that the United States has never really had a properly funded public broadcaster. The United States came to public broadcasting later than everybody else, and it funds its public broadcasters at lower levels than anybody else in the world. The level of distrust and polarization and hyperpartisanship that the United States is experiencing right now, I'm not going to try to claim that that wouldn't exist if they had a strong and well-funded public broadcaster, but I do think that if you read the research, it suggests that maybe their situation would be less bad than it is today. And now we come to what I think might actually be the most important research finding. So multiple studies have found that countries that have strong public broadcasters, they have a smaller knowledge gap between social groups, different social groups. And so public broadcasting, one of the studies said it this way, I'm quoting here, they said, public broadcasting tends to minimize the knowledge gap between advantaged and disadvantaged people, and it thereby contributes to a more egalitarian pattern of citizenship overall. I think that's really crucial, and I think that because sometimes I think we find ourselves considering public broadcasting through a kind of a consumerist, an individualist, a kind of personal lens, like, did I enjoy that program? And I actually don't think that that is the most important lens, right? So what I just sort of enumerated, those are the things that we started to lose when we cut public broadcaster funding and when we started shifting towards a more kind of market-centric approach. I want to shift gears right now and start to talk about the internet. In the early days of the internet, a lot of people, including me, believed that the internet was going to usher in a new kind of golden age of access to information and strong, fabulous public debate. And I can see you smiling, right? It's okay to laugh. The mass media had performed a restrictive and a gatekeeping function, and we felt that knocking down those gates was going to have broadly positive societal effects. We were going to be better informed, we were going to be more thoughtful, we were going to be more nuanced, and ultimately we were going to be wiser. That was our hope. It was also the case, back in those early days of the internet, that Western governments decided to take a hands-off approach to the internet in a way that was really different from how they had handled earlier communications technology revolutions, like the invention of radio or the invention of television. When radio and TV came along, governments had deliberately chosen to intervene to establish and to fund institutions that they thought would provide social value, that would be a public good. With the internet, they did not do that. And in fact, in a number of countries, they actually did exactly the opposite. By 2013, regulators in 11 European countries were requiring their public broadcasters to submit to what they called public value tests. And what that meant was if a public broadcaster wanted to launch a new digital product or service, they were first required to show evidence that suggested that the public value that would be created by that service would outweigh any harm or damage or risk that might be done in the private sector.
We're getting some ads.
And that was the exact opposite of the way that things had historically worked. We used to actively carve out space for the public good, and what we were doing now, our regulators were doing, is asking public broadcasters to fit themselves in sort of around the margins, around the edges of, again, this market-centered approach. And in this new market-centered world, there were a lot of people who felt that public broadcasting might actually no longer be necessary because we were going to have this plethora of options. And so if public broadcasting was even going to exist, it was felt, it might be as a kind of a vestige of its former self. It might serve small audiences with sort of quaint, old-fashioned tastes. The bulk of public learning and of public debate, people thought, might happen elsewhere. It might happen entirely on new platforms. And initially, and forgive me if you disagree, but initially I felt like it looked like the people who thought all this, there was a chance that they were right. Because in the beginning there was, and we will remember this, there was a huge flourishing of access to information and to debate on the internet. You know, newspapers and magazines, they suddenly started publishing online for free. And so people living in places like Fredericton or Regina or Port Hope, all places where I have lived and where I have subscribed expensively to, for example, the Sunday New York Times, right? Those places, people there, could now get easy, free access to the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the BBC, whoever they wanted. A guy named Jimmy Wales created Wikipedia. Wikipedia very quickly grew to become a high-quality, comprehensive information resource. It was free, it's convenient, it was available to anybody who had internet access. People started talking to each other online. We were using services like LiveJournal or GeoCities or Blogger. That did open up a whole new world of self-expression and dialogue, and for the first time, there were a lot of voices included that had never been part of the public discourse before. And in authoritarian countries, it suddenly got a lot harder to censor news and to censor people's access to information. And eventually, sites like Facebook and Twitter, they became places where pro-democracy activists could come together and they could share information and they could organize to make things better for themselves and their country. So that was all awesome. The problem with it was it did not last long. So what happened? Journalistic organizations used to get the vast majority of all the advertising revenue that was created. When they moved online, that money started to shift to Google and then also later to Facebook. And so today, Google and Facebook combined make about 85 cents of every digital ad dollar. That broke the business model for the news industry. Ever since then, news organizations have been struggling to survive. It's been really difficult. Today, there are about half as many working journalists in the United States as there were 25 years ago. And we all know that journalism in this country, in many countries, is in terrible trouble. We started to see a big uptick on the internet of harassment and abuse. We started to see as a result of that women and members of minority groups, members of marginalized groups started, again, to get driven out of the public discourse. They were pushed from the public spaces. And in a lot of categories of online activity, so search, social media, shopping, we had a crowded and very diverse and kind of flourishing marketplace, but dominant players started to emerge over time. It turns out, who knew, that the internet has very strongly monopolistic tendencies, and so it's a kind of winner-take-all environment. And so we started to see one or two leaders in each category. And so by 2010, it had become apparent that rather than freeing ourselves of gatekeepers, what had happened was we had just exchanged one set of gatekeepers for another set. The old ones had been newspapers and broadcasters, and the new ones are the tech companies. So it's Google, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Apple. The new gatekeepers are different from their predecessors in at least two important ways. And so first, they are American multinational companies. They are not rooted in the countries in which they operate. So the CBC belongs to Canada, and it is accountable to Canadians. Facebook is not. And then secondly, the tech companies are largely unconstrained by any commitment to protect the public interest. So they might want to protect the public interest, and they might hope to find a way to reconcile the public interest with their business interests, but that's not inevitable. The public interest is not baked into what they do. They aren't accountable for serving it, and nor are they accountable for harming it. So this is where I think I want to start talking about business models. It was not that long ago, it was about 15 years ago, that the internet had not yet developed a business model. But gradually, business models have started to emerge. What it looks like today is for entertainment and for some kinds of non-commodity news, the business model is user-paid, and normally that is through subscriptions. For everything else, the business model is advertising. So advertising has always been dependent on large audiences, and that means that there has always been an incentive for publishers to be kind of sensationalistic, both in what they choose to cover and in how they choose to cover it. But with the advent of advertising on the internet, a whole set of new practices started to emerge. So a whole new discipline, a new vocabulary, an entirely new set of jobs. And they were all aimed solely at attracting and monetizing user attention, and so getting people to click on something. First, new tools got developed, and those tools made it possible for content creators to continuously test and optimize their work so that people would click on it. And that meant that over time, everything from headlines to image selection to the length of a text-based story, all of that became optimized to attract the largest possible number of clicks. And I want to emphasize, because I think it's important, that this is not about getting people to read something or enjoy something or learn something. It is really simple. What is being measured and what is being monetized is the act of clicking on the link.
We're going to practice
And then second what happened was social media started to play a bigger role in how people found new content. We used to find new content through search engines. Now it was mostly through Facebook, Twitter, and other social media. And that led content creators to optimize their work so that people would not just click on it, they would share it with their friends. So there's a Columbia Law professor named Tim Wu, and he wrote about this in his book called The Attention Merchants. So Tim described how the website BuzzFeed was the first to pioneer a lot of these new practices and new techniques, and then later BuzzFeed was copied by established news and information sites, so the Washington Post or The Atlantic. And the result of this, Tim wrote, was that the internet by 2015 had become thoroughly overrun by commercial junk, much of it directed at the very basest human impulses of voyeurism and titillation, end quote. So that sounds a little bit colorful and maybe a little bit overstated, but I think the truth is that we have all had that experience. We are on our phone, we are on our laptop, we click on something, it leads us somewhere else, we follow that thing, and then maybe like 2 hours later, we shake ourselves and we come awake and we realize that we have just spent a ton of time on the internet and that the experience has been in no way satisfying or fulfilling. We didn't learn anything, maybe we don't even remember what we spent the last 2 hours doing.
I'm gonna delete
So that's what the internet was like by 2015.
Yeah, because we're not allowed.
2015 was also the year, we did not know this at the time, but it was also the year when a new kind of online publishing operation started to spring up, making what we have now come to call hyperpartisan news. So you probably started seeing hyperpartisan news in your own newsfeed maybe in 2015.
I'm just gonna stop